Today's brief has been created with open source information readily available on the internet as well as books. However, take it with a pinch of salt because some aspects have been kept secret due to said country's Official Secrets Act, and sometimes Wikipedia is probably the best place to find the information. So sit back, relax, and let's get into today's briefing. His Majesty's ship Hood would be one of the most famous British warships to ever grace the oceans of the world. She would be at the time the largest vessel ever built and be armed to the teeth with the best naval rifles in the British arsenal. Conceived in the wake of an intelligence report from Germany about a design for their new Mackensen-class battlecruisers, the Royal Navy would need to counter this, as they expected it was going to be a 7-strong class. This class was expected to mount either 8 12-inch guns or 8 14-inch guns. So to counter this, it was devised that this new battlecruiser would be a derivative of the currently building Renown class, but it would be improved by the number of guns as well as bumping up the armour protection. Hood would be ordered on April 7th, 1916 from John Brown & Co. on Slipway 460. By the day before the Battle of Jutland, her design at the time was finalised. The keel was in place, frames were in place, and she was about 2 months into build. The Battle of Jutland would ensue, seeing the Invincible, Indefatigable, Queen Mary detonate from magazine penetrations as well as ammunition mishandling. At the time, the Admiralty believed that the first two vessels, Invincible and Indefatigable, were sunk from penetrations to the magazine, like that of the Defence. Queen Mary was also thought to have been sunk by ammunition mishandling. This belief would drive the Admiralty to add an additional 5,000 tons of armour plating to protect the ship against such damaging hits that downed these vessels before her. She would have a numerous amount of redesigns before she even made it to the water. There was an addition of the additional armour, which would make her sit about 1.2 metres deeper in the water. Additional electric generators would also be added, and by the time of her redesign, she would actually end up being the world's first quote-unquote fast battleship. Hood would displace about 46,680 tons, with an overall length of 860 feet 7 inches, a beam of 104 feet 2 inches, and a draft of 32 feet. In normal metric measurements, however, that would equate to 262.3 metres long, 31.8 metres in beam, and have a 9.8 metre draft. To give you an idea of actually how big Hood was, she would actually be 7 metres shorter than the RMS Titanic, which had come about 4 years before. She would be oil-fuelled, with 24 boilers that powered 4 large steam turbines, which turned the ship's 4 triple-bladed propellers for a top speed on trials of about 32 knots. However, her large size and fuel consumption would give her a range of about 5,332 nautical miles at 20 knots. Rather short range, but understandable for a ship at the height of the Empire, with fueling stations dotted everywhere around the globe. She would take until mid to late August 1918 to launch into the River Clyde stern first, being moved over to the fitting out yards for final fit out. These included the fitting out of the ship's main armament, giving her 4 dual 15-inch guns, 2 forward, 2 aft in superfiring mounts, in the new Mark II mount with increased elevation. 12 single 5.5-inch guns were also added, as well as 4 single anti-aircraft guns, and amazingly, 6 torpedo tubes would be added. By the end of Hood's fitting out period, her main armour belt was actually fitted. Her armour belt would be about 12 inches of steel, specifically Krupp cemented armoured steel. This formed her main belt, and would be angled at about 12 degrees outboard of the ship. It was also arranged into 3 sections. Fore and aft of the barbettes, the armour was thinned to about 5 to 6 inches on the forward and aft ends. The upper armoured belt would be about 7 inches, with 5 inches abreast of a barbette, and finally the upper belt was about 5 inches up to about a turret. Aside from the belt, the deck armour would range between 0.75 to 3 inches thick. The barbettes were 12 inches at the base of the turret and thinned down to about 5 inches, being behind the armoured belt. The turrets and their face would be about 15 inches thick, The sides and back would be 11 inches and the turret roof being about 5 inches. Aside from these, the conning tower maxed at about 11 inches thick and the transverse bulkheads were about 4 to 5 inches thick. She would be commissioned in mid-May 1920, entering the fleet as a flagship of the battlecruiser squadron of the Atlantic Fleet, making a cruise in Scandinavian waters for a while until she transited south to the Mediterranean for 2 consecutive years as a show of the flag as well as training with the Mediterranean Fleet before she would sail with the battlecruiser squadron for the West Indies and Brazil for a bit of a cruise. By 1923, Captain John M. Thurn would take command of the mighty Hood, along with the battlecruisers Repulse, the cruisers Danae, Dauntless, Delhi, Dragon and Dynadin of the 1st Cruiser Squadron. They sailed on November 27th from Devonport Naval Base, calling into ports such as Cape Verde, Cape Town, Freetown, Durban, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, Ceylon, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Hawaii, Canada and North America, with the cruisers making a stop in South America. Now that is a world tour. That deployment would overall be about 10 months. Whilst down under, the squadron would also escort HMAS Australia to the position where she would be scuttled in compliance with the Washington Naval Treaty. It's somewhat symbolic having 2 of the newest battlecruisers escort one of the oldest battlecruisers to a final resting spot. By the next year, the battlecruiser would end up visiting Lisbon in January 1925 to participate in the Vasco da Gama celebrations before continuing to transit to the Med for her yearly winter exercises, which she would continue for the rest of the decade. This would also see her commanding officer change every 2 years roughly. She would return to Devonport Naval Base in April 1929 for repairs, before going back out to sea to transit to Portsmouth, arriving on the 1st of May to be paid off into refit, for which she would end up having a major refit. However, no information in detail was completely given on the 1929 to 1931 refit, but she would emerge with a seaplane and catapult on her already low freeboard quarterdeck. She would be recommissioned on March 10th for trials, whilst being a tender to HMS Victory until mid-May, when her full crew would join and she would go back to sea. She would remain at sea off the south coast of England until late May. However, whilst at sea, she would lose her aircraft whilst trying to take off near Weymouth. She would end up back in Portsmouth in late July for a slight part of maintenance, before she would end up taking part in the Portsmouth Navy Week. She would then sail for Invergordon, ending up taking part in that Invergordon mutiny over pay, which ironically enough is one of those things you just don't take from sailors. You don't take their rum, and you don't underpay them. They get rather annoyed. Anyway, over the rest of the year, she would sail back and forth from Invergordon to Portsmouth. In January of 1932, she would sail for a spring cruise to the West Indies and Caribbean, joining up with the battlecruiser Repulse, the cruisers Norfolk, Dorsetshire and Delhi, arriving in Portsmouth in May. Over the rest of the year, she would end up sailing again up and down the east coast and south coast of England, with the odd spot of exercises. She would continue this into 1933, but this time sailing for the Mediterranean for her spring cruise, as well as a brief refit in June, possibly ditching the catapult by this point. 1934 and 1935 would pretty much be the same as the last couple of years, of spring cruises being in the Mediterranean, and that of odd exercises, but in the latter year, Hood would suffer damage to her starboard stern in a collision with the Renown, and then take part in the Silver Jubilee Review off Spithead for King George V. In September 1935, she would be in Gib when Italy invaded Abyssinia, now modern-day Ethiopia. She would also be, funnily enough, visited by the Emperor of Abyssinia for help. 1936 would be more demanding on the ship. She would conduct a spring cruise in the Mediterranean, and she would again host the Emperor of Abyssinia. Is that how you say it? Abyssinia? Anyway, as well as having to dry dock for repairs to a turbine. She would also require dry docking periods in Portsmouth for more permanent repairs. Whilst in Pompey, her condensers would also be cleaned, turbines repaired, and she would go back out to sea. In 1937, she would be part of a naval squadron that would patrol off the north coast of Spain, as Spain decided to go into a little bit of civil war. She would even have a sighting of the heavy cruiser Admiral Spain. After her patrol, she would sail back to home waters, where she would end up taking part in the coronation review of King George VI on May the 7th. But she would also end up getting a visit from His Majesty on the 20th of the same month. In the latter half of the year, she would conduct gunnery practice with HMS Protector, who would be towing a 15-inch gun tow target. But in this, she would also gain her first kill, though indirect and very accidental. The sound of the salvo caused Protector's cat to sadly have a heart attack, roll over, and die. Unfortunately, that was the end for that little pussy. Anyway, she would transit back to the Mediterranean for the rest of the year, as well as the next year. In 1939, her famous crew photo would take place in Malta, before she sailed back to Portsmouth to enter a 7-month refit, which would see her turbines repaired, the anti-aircraft armament would be upgraded, replacing some of the rather obsolete anti-aircraft guns with some very bad, unrotated projectile aerial mine launchers. To make things better, however, she would also be fitted with 3 octuple 2-pounder pom-pom anti-aircraft guns, numerous 12.7mm machine guns, and 7 of the excellent twin 4-inch high-angle anti-aircraft guns, which would improve the ship's medium and heavy AA. It is also believed at this point that the torpedo tubes would be replaced by 2 twin 21-inch torpedo tubes. She would emerge in mid-August to proceed back to sea, where she would sail down to Scapa Flow with the carrier Courageous, the destroyer Sturdy. Here she would travel to Invergordon and then back until the commencement of hostilities with Nazi Germany in September 1939. With war on the horizon, she sailed with renown and repulse to the Iceland Faroes Gap for a patrol, just in case that any German raiders made it out into the North Atlantic. On September 3rd, 1939, at 1100 hours, war was declared with Nazi Germany and her allies, and 2 days later, Hood would be at sea, and funnily enough, actually avoiding a U-boat attack by narrowly turning to avoid a torpedo. However, no ID has actually been said for the U-boat that almost sank HMS Hood. She would end up sailing back for Scapa for oil, provisions, as well as to practice in the anti-aircraft department and a bit of R&R for the crew, before she put back to sea with Renown, Belfast, Edinburgh and 4 escorting destroyers. They would sail for Iceland and the Faroes Gap, with an aim, again, to hunt and sink German raiders, making a break for the Atlantic. She would arrive back in Scapa for oil and have some more fresh water, and have a freshwater washdown, with, ironically enough, weirdly, a cinema being rigged. So, with her freshwater washdown complete, cinema rigged, she would sail for Loch Ewe, before being visited by Sir Winston Churchill and the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, Admiral Sir Charles Forbes. She would sail for Scapa Flow before deploying to cover a raid on the Skagerrak, before turning away after escort sighted a possible U-boat. She'd be subjected to a near miss from a 500-pound bomb from a Ju-88 Stuka that caused the port bilge to flood. A few rivets would be popped and condensers would be damaged, along with minimal shrapnel damage. She would return to Scapa Flow for a few days before putting back out to sea with Repulse, Aurora, Sheffield and 4 destroyers to intercept the Gneisenau and Corran, as well as about 9 destroyers bound for Norway, but they would not make contact in the end. By mid-October, she would escort armed merchant cruisers as part of a northern patrol with the battleships Nelson, Rodney and their accompanying 6 destroyers. These vessels would cover an iron ore convoy bound for Narvik, before getting attacked by a U-boat. 3 torpedoes were launched, 1 completely missed, and 2 supposedly hit the Hood, but they did not explode, and Hood sailed merrily away with a very peeved U-56 watching on. Nelson and Hood would detach and go hunting for merchant ships, before Hood would break off and head for Rosyth, and then Plymouth for minor repairs. She would sail from Guz on November 25th to intercept a so-called pocket battleship, but the armed merchant cruiser HMS Rawalpindi soon realised these were not Deutschland-class heavy cruisers, but were in fact the 2 Scharnhorst-class battleships. However, Hood would sail too late, and Rawalpindi would be sunk, the German ships would break out into the Atlantic, and Hood would have to retire to Greenock until December, where she would conduct another patrol between Iceland and the Faroes. She wouldn't find anything, but we would be tasked with providing distant cover to a Norwegian convoy. Hood would end up rounding out 1939 with convoy escort duties, as well as a couple of patrols in the North Sea, as well as the areas around the British Isles. 1940 would break, and Hood would still be at sea. She would be covering mostly convoys for the first couple of months, before the ship was required to dock down into a dry dock for retubing of her condensers. With repairs complete by the end of May, she would sail for Liverpool for refitting. This refit will remove the 5.5-inch secondary guns, as well as fix some of the ventilation and other bits internally. By mid-June, she would be back at sea, escorted by Canadian destroyers, destined to cover an Anzac convoy of troops consisting of the liners RMS Queen Mary, Empress of Britain, Aquitania, Mauretania, Andes, and the Empress of Canada. The convoy made it to the Clyde, and the ship would pull into Greenock to refuel and a little bit of repainting at the ship. Upon completion, she then sailed for the Med, escorted by 5 destroyers and the carrier HMS Ark Royal, arriving on the 23rd of June. 2 days later, France bowed out of the war, and the ships would sail for the Canaries, destined to intercept the French battleship Richelieu, who was reported to have sailed from Dakar, and if possible, escort her into Gibraltar. But intel reports suggested she had returned to Dakar, and so Hood and Force H turned about and returned to Gibraltar. In early July, Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville would take command of Force H and sail for Operation Catapult, effectively the neutralisation of the French fleet. I won't cover the battle in this video, as it's a crazy subject and has already been covered by my good friend Drakenifel. To cut a long story short, the French Admiral was too stuck up, tried to play the British bluff, and the Royal Navy opened fire, and the French fleet basically sank. However, it did kind of stop them from falling into the hands of the Germans, for a time. After leaving the area, the task group would come under fire from French bombers, but they scored no hits on the task force. They were as useful as a chocolate fireguard, to be honest. The ships would make it back to Gibraltar 2 days after the attack, refueling and replenishing ammunition before going back on convoy escort in the Mediterranean. The force, currently escorting a convoy based for Malta, were given the mission to attack an airfield at Calabria, but the Regia Aeronautica would come and attack the task force, but, ironically enough, didn't actually score any hits. The bombardment wouldn't actually take place, and as such the ships would return to the convoy, and they'd make it to Malta. For the remainder of the year, she continued to escort convoys in the Mediterranean, and actually this time bombarded Calabria airfield, returning back to the home fleet and made a few sorties with other vessels in the North Sea as well as the Denmark Strait areas, before returning to Scapa Flow for Christmas. I cannot think of a worse place to spend Christmas than Scapa Flow. 1941 would be a hectic year for the ship, however it'd also be a rather short one. She would sail on the 2nd of January for the Denmark Strait to continue supporting a mine-laying effort in the region before returning to Rosyth for a 3-month refit. Her draft would be recoated, the blades in her starboard turbine would be replaced after Hood tried to catch the Strasbourg after Operation Catapult and pretty much wrote that turbine off completely. The Type 284 gunnery radar would be removed, the forward topmast removed as well. A Type 279 Alpha air search radar was installed, the forward torpedo lookout would be deleted, and her steam picket boats would be removed for 35-foot motor launches. After refit, she would re-arm, re-ammunition, and proceed to sea on March 18th, in search of the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. But after 5 days, they slipped the Hood and broke into the Atlantic. She returned to Scapa Flow for 5 days, before sailing in company with 3 destroyers to act as an escort for convoy HX-118 from Halifax, but they would divert to the Bay of Biscay to blockade the 2 Scharnhorsts in Brest to stop them from breaking out again. She would make a quick stop into Scapa Flow, before returning back to the Bay of Biscay until April 14th, when she sailed back up to Scapa Flow. Reports then started flooding into the Admiralty that Bismarck was about to break out, and the fleet was put onto high alert. But Bismarck would turn east and the fleet reverted from immediate action. After a few days at sea, she came back into Scapa Flow on May 6th. She would remain there until the 22nd, taking part in gunnery training for the main and anti-aircraft guns, conducting range and inclination training with King George V, as well as the Admiral, his staff, C&C Home Fleet, the skippers, and the command teams of the ships, basically trying to work out how to take on the Bismarck. On the 22nd, the fleet was pretty much at stage 1, and Hood, in company with the new battleship Prince of Wales, set sail for the Denmark Strait. On the 23rd, the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen were spotted by HMS Suffolk entering the Denmark Strait. Vice Admiral Holland, in charge of Hood, Prince of Wales and their escorting destroyers, plotted an interception course, hopefully putting the British ships in a crossing the T formation. Alas, on the 24th, the Germans found themselves actually crossing the British's T, and so the Battle of the Denmark Strait had begun. The British ships raced towards the Germans at about 28 knots, which was the Prince of Wales' maximum speed. The ships were correcting their course as they sailed, occasionally altering course to bring the aft turrets to bear, whilst decreasing the range to negate Hood's weakness, the thin aft deck armour. Bismarck and Prince Eugen would rip Hood apart, with one of Eugen's shells hitting the boat deck, setting a ready-to-use magazine alight. Bismarck would cause the most damage. One shell hit the spotting top, killing all at the top of the mast, affecting some of Hood's firing. To this point, she had actually not acquired the range. Bismarck's 5th salvo would be the most devastating. Just before 6 AM, Holland gave the order to Prince of Wales and Hood to conduct a 20-degree turn to port, masking the aft turrets to the German vessels. But as the ship's rudders started to move, a shell from the turret Caesar plunged through in towards Hood, punching through the 7-inch belt armour that was visible due to a trough formed by the ship's wake, just forward of the aft bulkhead of the aft engine room, going into the 4-inch magazine just ahead of the 15-inch aft magazines, and exploding, causing a massive fire and started to build up pressure. The engine room starts to flood from a 15-inch hole caused by the shell. This caused the pressure in the compartment to build and build and build, bursting through the ventilation ducts onto the boat deck. The 4-inch magazine detonates, causing the 15-inch magazine behind it to also detonate, as X-Turret is in the process of bringing shells and cordite up from the magazine. The ship's aft end explodes, blowing the turrets clean out of their mounts. The ship is now being held together by metal and a structure that's very similar in resemblance to Swiss cheese. The fore and aft ends of the ship start to roll to different size, the bow rolling to port, and the aft end rolling to starboard. As the momentum carries the ship, the steel that was keeping the ship together snaps, and as such, the ship breaks in two. Hood begins to sink very, very rapidly, sinking in a V shape. The stern section sinks very quickly, with the bow rising out of the water and going down aft end first. She goes nearly vertical as the forward turrets give off a last defiant salvo as the ship slips underwater, taking down 1,419 crew, leaving 3 survivors. Orderly Signalman Teddy Briggs, able seaman Robert Tilburn, and midshipman William John Dundas. The sinking of the Hood caused a nationwide outcry, and Churchill ordered the destruction of the Bismarck at all costs. Luckily, or unluckily, whichever side you look at it, Prince of Wales would score some hits on Bismarck, punching a hole through her forward fuel tank and causing her to need to sail for Brest. However, that is a story for a different day. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you learned something new. Don't forget to like the video before you leave a comment, and give a suggestion of what you think I should do next, as well as if you have a question you want me to answer, please put it in the comment section on the pinned post. Apart from that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I recommend doing so, because I have some very interesting content coming out very soon. If you want to support the channel, there is a Patreon page, but that's entirely up to you. If you do so, there is some interesting perks to actually being a Patreon to the page. Apart from that, all you need to do is say thank you very much, have a nice day, and here's a sneak peek at next week's video.